Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Film Club with Feed the Reel and a special live recording of our podcast, Insurgent Imaginations. I'm Katie Pettit, the director and founder of Current Movements, based here in DC. We are currently at Eaton Hotel, which is really exciting. And yeah, we have a really exciting conversation for tonight, and I will kick it over to my co-host in just a second. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Feed the Reel, which is our new program with Current Movements. So Feed the Reel is a new online platform created to bring radical filmmakers together, inexperienced and expert, to learn and teach each other about social documentary filmmaking. And our film club events like this one, this is our second, we had one last week, and we'll have more in the future, are a gathering of filmmakers to ask questions and get to know folks who have kind of done this work. And this one's really special because we have Denise, who was a part of the film, The First Rainbow Coalition, which is streaming now until July 7th on PBS. And so we'll be talking about that film and getting into it. And if you have questions at any point tonight, you can put it into the Zoom chat. We're also streaming at the Current Movement's Facebook page, so you can put questions into that chat, and we'll get those over to our panelists. And an exciting part about tonight is that it will be a segment of our Insurgent Imagination podcast. We're doing a summer series on solidarity, solidarity within our grassroots movements. And so a little bit about Insurgent Imagination. It's a podcast that explores film and art through a revolutionary lens. Each episode, we dive into works of radical storytelling to explore how these stories inspire movements for collective liberation. So if you haven't heard our podcast, definitely check it out anywhere that podcasts are streamed, iTunes, Spotify, all the things. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Mayoran, who will introduce himself and our guests.
Hi, everyone. This is Mayoran Turachelvam speaking to you from the Bay Area, where I have been fortunate to collaborate with Katie and everybody on the Insurgent Imagination podcast from my position as an assistant professor of social justice fiction filmmaking at San Francisco State University. So it's really great to be back in the Eaton screening room. I have, in fact, spent quite some time there back when I was on the East Coast, and to talk about this incredible film, The First Rainbow Coalition, with the filmmaker, with Denise, and now I'm going to introduce them. Ray Santisteban is a San Antonio-based documentary filmmaker, educator, and film curator. His work gravitates toward political subjects and artistic profiles addressing themes of justice, memory, and political transformation. He graduated from NYU's film program and made the Student Academy Award-winning documentary Passing It On, as well as a documentary about the legendary, for those of you on the East Coast or perhaps worldwide, Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and was a senior producer of the Visiones Latino Art and Culture documentary series that was broadcast nationally on PBS. Today, we're going to be talking about his recent documentary film, The First Rainbow Coalition, which was broadcast by PBS Independent Lens and is available, as Katie said, on the PBS website. If you want to really celebrate freedom and liberation this weekend, you could probably do no better than to watch freedom fighters, heroic ancestors and elders, and the work that they did in the First Rainbow Coalition. And we have also with us, deeply honored to introduce Denise Oliver-Velez, a political activist and community organizer for over 50 years. Denise's work and organizing has embodied the notion of intersectionality long before there was a word for it or a jargon for it. She was a member of both the Young Lords Party and the Black Panther Party. She worked in community media and public broadcasting for many years. And for those of you in DC, you'd be excited to know she was a co-founder and program director of Pacifica's first minority-controlled radio station, WPFW in DC. She taught cultural anthropology and women's studies at SUNY New Paltz. And you can find her blogging and writing at Daily Kos, where she is a writer and editor. And there's a lot of work that you can read, every week I'm seeing. So welcome, Ray, Denise. It's super cool to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. So we'll get right into it. Ray, you and I met right before the pandemic, and we actually screened the First Rainbow Coalition as a Current Movement's monthly screening in January or February 2019. It was the last screening we were able to do, and it was amazing. Such a great film. We had a packed theater, and we had Miss Lynn French, who was with the Panthers, in-house with us, answering questions. And we also had a local organizer who was with Black Youth Project 100. So we had this really great intergenerational conversation about being Black organizers and organizing around multiracial coalitions. And you reached out not too long ago about this great series of events that you're doing, kind of spreading that multi-generational, multiracial coalition conversation work around the country, and I'm super glad you did. We're so happy to dig into this film and this work even more, and I'm excited about digging into who you are and how you got started. And can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this kind of filmmaking and where it all started? It's the crux of current movements and Feed the Real and Insurgent Imagination, this combination of film and activism, but we so rarely see it. So where did this kind of love for telling the stories of movements come from?
Just very briefly, when I was at NYU, I was like just wanting to make films, but not really having a sort of purpose for it. And my girlfriend at the time, her mom was a lawyer, and she said, hey, this guy, William Kunstler, is going to be speaking with one of the Black Panthers, Sophia Bakari Alston, about a guy in prison, Dhruba bin Wahad. And I didn't know who any of these people were. I'd never heard of William Kunstler, but something about it, I said, oh, let me go check this out. Because when I was at NYU, I was trying to experience everything that was part of the university environment. And they just blew my mind. I mean, they told me about this guy that had been falsely imprisoned, and he, was set up, and I didn't believe any of it. I said, these guys are lying. I don't believe this. And then I said, why would the government put someone in prison for no reason? I mean, I didn't say it, but in my mind. But then I was like, you know what? I gotta look into this. Like, if they're saying this and they seemed so authentic, I said, let me look into this. And I did, and I learned about COINTELPRO. I learned about, all this stuff. And that's when I started working on this film that became Passing It On, which is a kind of the story of how Dhruba bin Wahad was falsely incarcerated and how he eventually got released out of prison. And so that film started at NYU, and then eventually we graduated, but it got funded by ITVS, one of the PBS funders, the first year it was created. And then the film did very well on the festival circuit. It ended up being on POV in 1993. But that sort of following that story is what got me into this world. And then my mind was like, I want to learn more. I want to learn more. I want to learn about the Chicano movement. I want to learn about AIM. I want to learn about, the Young Lords. And so all during my vacations, I would travel. I would take buses. I would rent cars, and I would go visit Chacha Menace in Chicago in like 1991. I went to the Rosebud Reservation like in 1992, stayed out there. I went to Los Angeles and talked to members of the Brown Berets. So I was taking all this in, and that sort of, all of this, of course, is in my mind, and then it starts coming out in the films that I'm making.
I love that. Thank you.
that you actually touched on some things that we're going to get deeper into about how you built the relationships with the subjects of your story. And it seems like it's been a lifelong kind of friendship and collaboration. But I'm going to ask a question for those folks who haven't seen the film, for you to be able to break it down a little bit for us. As complex as this answer might be, what was the Rainbow Coalition? And then, for Denise, like, what is a coalition and why do we need them?
In terms of just what the Rainbow Coalition was an alliance started by Fred Hampton in Chicago in 1969 that brought together the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, which were a Puerto Rican group predominantly, and a group of Southern migrants called the Young Patriots. And so they formed this alliance, and it was a loose kind of alliance, and they kind of worked their way through. But the key thing was they knew that they were all suffering under police brutality. They knew that their communities had poor housing. They knew that they had a lack of education, and they wanted to push back. And these are militant groups. These are groups that are sort of on the outsides of sort of some of the other mainstream groups. And they're really young. I mean, they're 18, 17, some of them are 16-year-old. And they call themselves like street. These are people who used to hang out in the street corners. And so they had an affinity with each other because they kind of lived similar experiences. And so it was a unique time in Chicago, which was the most segregated city in the US for all sakes and purposes. And through this unique assemblage of leaders, Chacha Menes and Junebug Boykin and Hy Thurman and of course Fred Hampton and Bob Lee, it was this thing that should have happened. And that spark of that idea, I think, the waves of that were started to spread out from Chicago. And, I think it was starting to affect, the movements at the time. But of course, this is kind of the tail end of the 60s. Unfortunately, all the other movements had already slowly been getting smaller because of the FBI oppression and the police oppression. So it came at a time, but it was like the repression was so intense that it didn't really last long, unfortunately.
And Denise, tell us about coalition organizing. What is it, and how do we do it?
Well, think about it this way. You hold your hand up and spread your fingers out. And it's real easy to break any one of those fingers. You can snap it. Let me stop because I'll snap my own finger off. And then you take these fingers and you fold them down and you close them like this. And you have a fist. And you have a very powerful tool. And if you look at the demographics of this country, there is no one group of people that really can totally control everything. We know that a vast majority of people nowadays in what we call the white community, and I put that like this, we know who voted for Donald Trump and for fascists and whatever. But there are also people who are white who didn't, okay? And who live, like Ray was saying, under objective conditions that are maybe not always the same as what happens in other communities, but they're certainly equally oppressive across the board. Dead is dead. And if you're dead from lack of health care and food and clothing, good jobs, education, or whatever, I don't care what color you painted, okay? But it only makes sense, it's very pragmatic. You find people with like feelings, like causes, and you may have different cultures. You may speak differently, look differently, do things differently, sing differently, get married differently, don't get married differently. But you have a basic humanity, and that oppression can bring you together. So it behooves you to, from a very pragmatic point of view, say, I need to build coalitions. And then there's another side of that. Bernice Johnson Reagan always said, if you're in a coalition and you're comfortable, it's not a broad enough coalition. So you're going to have to experience and get out of your easy chair. Sometimes we're very comfortable just hanging with our own kin, and find ways to stretch your own, because there are personal boundaries. There may be political ones, and like you said in introducing me, we didn't have the term intersectionality. Actually, we didn't have terms for a lot of the things nowadays. You talk about environmental justice and, none of that we had. We borrowed stuff from some books we picked up, and we did sort of mix and match politics. No one was a doctrinaire Marxist. If Mao had something to say that made sense, you took that in. It didn't make any difference. Ho Chi didn't care. Frederick Douglass, whoever, Malcolm. We learned a lot about Native American history and stuff. Until I was active politically, I didn't know that the Iroquois Confederacy contributed to what is the U.S. Constitution, because they don't teach that in school. So I know I just ran off the mouth too long, but the point is that be practical. You don't have to get some kind of intellectual textbook to figure out that it makes sense. Take those fingers and bring them together, and that's a solid fist. So when we talk about solidarity, we're talking about that kind of strength. And there's a reason, if you see us in our posters and whatever, we got that fist up, because that was what we learned we had to do. We're stronger together than we are apart. And you need to have that kind of strength.
I love that. And I really resonated with what you said around if you're in a coalition and you're feeling comfortable, or then the work maybe isn't happening. I did work within Movement for Black Lives DC, which was a multiracial coalition, which is different than the national or other chapters. And so we had Surge, who is white folks, and Asian Pacific Islander Resistance, and many different Black organizing groups. And we organized together for 4 to 5 years. And there was definitely a lot of hard moments. And then when it got easy, that's, I think, when we knew it was time to separate ways and find different coalitions to be a part of. So yes, thank you for that. Ray, something Mayoran and I talk a lot about is accountability, and how filmmakers can be accountable to the communities that they are working with and filming in. Can you talk about how you've navigated that as a person living in San Antonio, Texas, who doesn't claim to be an organizer, or has very different experiences than maybe the folks that you filmed for this piece of work, or any of the other films that you've made? How did you navigate accountability and showing up for folks?
I think, part of the thing for me, again, because of my trajectory of being involved in this kind of search for so many years, the thing was people knew me, and I didn't just fly in and get my thing and get out. I had working relationships with these folks for a long time. I had done a bunch of oral histories with Cha-Cha Menace back in 1991. We probably did 30 or 40 oral histories about Chicago and activism there. So I was I was working with these groups in some ways, and when I went out to the Rosebud Reservation, I made friends out there, and I went out there for 6 years, every summer. So the way that I work is usually long term. I keep in contact with people. I stay in contact with them, and I call them up. If it's their birthday, I wish them happy birthday. I'm not extractive. I'm not just trying to get things from them. I'm just part of their life, and they're part of my life, and we stay in contact. And that's true of almost everyone I've met. That's the way I approach this. I'm a filmmaker, but again, the way I got into it was me trying to learn about my own history, the history of this country. And so I'm coming at it in a very different way. And I've worked on many, many films at this point about that era. That's been the prime focus of my work. This actually is probably the culmination of all that work, because this is my final statement, is that I've worked on films about the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, the Chicano movement. And each one of those movements, every time when I was working on those films, I would learn about their alliances. They were talking about their alliances. I'm like, how come no one's talking about this, that you had alliances? For example, the Chicano movement with the American Indian movement, or the Black Panthers with the Iwer Kern. And so this film is that statement. This is what I learned after 30 years, is that everybody was working together to some extent. They had a lot of issues that were similar. And there was a spirit of solidarity that maybe we don't have now, that I think the folks had back then. And I thought it was important to share that idea, and to maybe rekindle it in some ways, but also to pay homage to those folks that stood up during that time and forged these coalitions during very difficult times. To just imagine trying to form a rainbow coalition with folks with Confederate flags today. It would still be a revolutionary thing that happened if it happened today, but it happened in Chicago '69. So that just goes to show you just this, how far ahead this idea was in this country.
When we spoke last week, you talked a little bit about how you were able to build relationship and trust with Bobby Lee. And so maybe not everyone has seen the film, but you build a really beautiful relationship and connection, and are able to capture his story in a way that hasn't really been shown before. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Bob Lee was, I mean, he's an incredible, exceptional person. I mean, the first time we met him, and he was like, shook my hand, he hugged me. You know, he just wanted to talk about the Chicano movement. He wanted to know what he was just a really, he just fascinated by the world around him. He knew so much about so many topics. And this is true of a lot of the activists, to tell you the truth. But Bob Lee and I did one interview with him, and then this was 12 years ago. So I did it in mini DV, right? Which is like this small format that nobody uses. But back then the independents were using it. And then everyone switched to HD. And I was like, hey, Bob, can we redo our interview? And he said, no. So literally 6 years went by. I kept asking Bob, but we would discourse. He's the only person in my life I've ever wrote letters to. We would write letters, and we would talk about books. We would talk about movies, and we would just, but every once in a while I'd say, hey, Bob, do you want to do an interview? So I tried to keep that thought in his mind, but we just were, you know, he loved talking about art and culture and history. And so when we connected on that level, it's just people that were, you know, interested in a lot of different things. And that kind of was the burgeoning of that trust, I think, which is the key to doing the work that I've done. Is I'm pretty straightforward with people. I tell them, hey, I'm a filmmaker. Like if they ask me, hey, Ray, can you be on our board? I'm like, no, I can't be on a board because I'm a filmmaker and I'm separate from your organization. And I just tell them I'm pretty straightforward about it, you know, and again, even if I wasn't organized, I'd be a very bad organizer. So I just stick with what I know how to do, and I enjoy it. And that was the thing with Bob, is we just got along, we just connected. And what happened was Bob, at a certain point, he had some health issues that were coming up. And I think he knew that these health issues were going to take over at some point. And that's when he said, hey, Ray, let's do that interview. So this was 6 years after the first interview. And then I think we did 4 or 5 interviews with him afterwards, but it took a while to do. And the most significant thing that came out of this was the first time I interviewed Bob about the Confederate flag. He was like, Ray, I was raised in Houston. I didn't care about the flag. I was raised all around it. And after 6 years, when we did the interview, that's when you see what's in the film, where he says, I didn't want to be around that flag. Who the, you know, F wants to be around that flag? So, you know, again, I think that part of that is just, you know, he was able to open up a little more about how he really felt. And he still was in coalition, even though he had a lot of issues, of course, with that Confederate flag, and who wouldn't?
That's, I don't, you know, when you say, okay, that's not, you know, I'm not an organizer, or I would be a bad organizer, that relationship building is organizing, you know, that's, don't sell yourself short. And that's the thing that, like, you know, since we are speaking to a lot of filmmakers today who may not have organizing experience, it's the thing that documentaries take a lot of time if you want to build the relationships, just like organizing. Related to that and the relationship building, a lot of the participants in your film, well, all of the participants in your film had experienced a lot of trauma and state violence and harm and loss. And as a filmmaker, how do you provide sort of a space of care and kind of compassion as they're sharing their stories, or like not, just extract people's pain without helping them heal?
Yeah, I actually will usually tell people, I'll tell them up front, say, hey, if you're feeling uncomfortable, let me know and we'll stop. And also I can tell when people are going into a dark place, and I'll just talk about something else. I'll just switch it. I'm not there to, it's a post-traumatic stress that they're going under. And, sometimes it'll come out. I'm not trying to force that. But I can tell you, they're people with real emotions. So, every single person I talked to about Fred Hampton would get emotional. Anyone that knew Fred Hampton cannot talk about him and then, not get teary-eyed, because it was such a devastating, had such a devastating effect on not only communities, but them as people. But for me as a filmmaker, I'm also thinking I need to honor this because we need to say it. We can't just we know that Fred Hampton, organized, we know all that, but his effect on people, I think was profound. And I wanted to try to at least touch on that in some ways. Cha-Cha, it talks about, breaking down at Fred Hampton's funeral. It's like, I was trying to be a macho, again, he's a guy coming out of a former gang, but he says, and I think that says a lot about kind of not only the friendships that sort of were created in those coalitions, but just about, these people were working, they were connected in a way that, they're allies. And I think that's a profound thing for them to go through. And when people around you are dying, it's not just, the stakes are very high at this time for all these activists. And again, the only way to tell it is to tell it. It's to just tell the story. But again, it's a very fine line, and you need to be very, very careful about it. I take no joy or when people are, when I take them to a dark place, because sometimes it takes a while for them to get out of it. Mm-hmm. And so I try to straddle that line. And again, I'll just literally just talk about, hey, let's talk about, some other thing, and then you'll find out that they'll bounce back if you, as long as they don't, you don't let them sink down. If they start going to a place, you'll see it, and you need to get them out of there.
That empathy is like the most important kind of interviewing skill for people to learn, and it's also one of the hardest skills to. I don't even know. Denise, do you think empathy can be taught to somebody?
Hold on for a minute. I have a dog in my lap.
I do too. I got one that's bringing me her toy.
Yes, I think it can be. It doesn't always work. But over time, politics is not just about things that you read in a book, somebody's Malcolm X documents or Marx or Lenin or whatever, I don't care, Che. And because it's about relationships. And so I've seen people who come in with very little empathy. I call it sort of this borderline sociopathy that is imposed upon you, that causes you to disconnect because the pain is so great. And I've seen it in very young people. We had some particularly, it's difficult when you're talking about bringing together groups of people, and this is inside the organization, some who come out of a gang background, some who come out of what we used to call petty bougie background and whatever, and bringing them all together and people bring their trauma with them. And so working out the interpersonal relationships within the context of an organization is just as important as the organizing that you're doing outside in the community. Because if you can't get your shit together in-house, you certainly aren't going to be able to do a very good job of doing it outhouse. And so I saw a lot of that happen. We had to deal with people bringing their, how they related interpersonally, particularly in the Young Lords. We talked an awful lot about machismo and who came in with this macho stuff. But we also had to deal with women in the organization. We talked about Marianismo and women who had been acculturated to always stepping back, not contradicting their man. And that doesn't work well when you're trying to organize in a community. So we had to sit down and even think about the baggage that had been imposed upon us by our culture, by our religion, you know, by our street sense, and then begin to peel that stuff away. And I'm telling you, it's not easy. I mean, and we were structured. You all can join groups and organizations. You go to a meeting once a week or something with a group of people. But we were doing this 24 hours a day. And you quit your job if you had a job, you know. If your old lady or your old man or whatever wasn't down with it, you left them, you know. Bye, see you. And I saw people even separate from their children, which is, again, a kind of trauma, you know, left them with grandma or something. So thinking about that kind of baggage, and we didn't have a lot of fancy terms for a lot of this stuff. We recognized those problems as we went along. Add into that, we had to deal with people who came into the organization who were shooting dope, you know, and say, you know, no, you can't do that. And we set up a place for people to detox. But it was hard. And I ultimately, the partner that I came into the Lord's with, I had to stand up and denounce him because he had OD'd for the third time. He went back to shooting dope. And that was very hard. This was the love of my life. And I have to stand up and say, you got to go, because you're putting the entire organization into jeopardy. And I think that the level, and Ray can attest to, he's been out to the res. You know the trauma that people have been under out on the res. I didn't spend time at Rosebud, I did at Pine Ridge. But every community has both its strengths and it has its disorders. And how do you, when we said that revolutionary is guided by true feelings of love for the people, we had to also learn to love our comrades that we were working with day in and day out, and how to resolve the kind of issues that come up. Because in our case, it wasn't just you fall out with somebody. You get mad and start talking shit about people, and you got COINTELPRO on your butt. You know, people get dead from interpersonal conflict, you know, and that's something that's very serious. And I think that you have to see that those risks that we took, and what really disturbs me, and I'm glad that Ray's film is going to be screened over the weekend, and he talked about the film Passing It On with Daruba. We still have people sitting in jail. You know, people are running around, yeah, right on, you know, revolutionary this, but they've left people sitting in jail for over 50 years. And people don't even know their names. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
I
looked
just
at
got an
Yankees.
email about Sundiata Acoli this morning, and further
Right.
work that folks are doing to get him out. But there's so many
So,
more.
so I just want to bring that up, that it's very important that when you see a film and you say, oh, that's an important history. Well, it's not history. It is, but it's also now. It's in the now and how you make those connections. And that's key.
Yeah, definitely. And I, the Panthers and the revolutionaries of the time, the 60s and 70s, are so good about reminding us younger generations about the importance of our political prisoners and making sure that we are doing all we can to get them out. And so I definitely want to encourage everyone who's listening today to do research on political prisoners here in this country. And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired like Ray to tell stories and kind of, reshift your life because of it, but it's just extremely important. And Denise, you were talking about how important it is to love not only your people, but your comrades when organizing. And Fred Hampton was so admired and adored, I think, because he loved, like, the love of his people was so radiant off of him. And it is, like you were saying, as a former Black Lives Matter organizer here in DC, it is so important to work to build relationships and trust and kind of ongoing like familial relationships with your fellow organizers. And that's a lot of work, but it's a lot of the work, because if we are working towards liberation of our people, of all marginalized people of the world, like, yeah, we have to first be able to do that within our own interpersonal communities, and we get to practice, a different way of being with our comrades, and it's not easy. So thank you for reminding us about that. I wanted to talk about your time within the Young Lords Party, and first ask if you're able to, just for people who are unfamiliar, like, what was that party? What were y'all working on in New York? And then if you could talk about, as a Black woman and not a Puerto Rican, but like, how did you see and how did you work on building interracial solidarity in your time there?
The Young Lords started in Chicago, which the film documents, and with interviews with Chacha Jimenez. The East Coast Young Lords, that later became the Young Lords Party, actually got its start on the campus at SUNY Old Westbury, which was an experimental college out on Long Island for the City University of New York. For the State University of New York. And a number of persons of color were imported out to the campus. The first student body only had 95 students on campus. Like I said, it was an experimental college. And they came to an organization in East Harlem called RGS, the Real Great Society, because they were looking, they were picking to have this sort of perfect campus. They had SDS students from Wisconsin and Chicago. They had African Americans, they had Latinos, they had a couple of Africans, from the continent, and they wanted Puerto Ricans, so they showed up at RGS and recruited several Puerto Ricans to go out to the campus, and they were promising people they would pay everything, no tuition, room and board, a stipend every month. This was like heaven. And I and my partner at the time was Puerto Rican, and they recruited me to go. They didn't ask me if I had ever been to college. I had already been on 4 different other campuses. They didn't ask me everything because their racism assumed, oh, this poor Puerto Rican lady, we're going to take her out to the campus. I called my mother up and I said, Mom, they want me to go to this college. They're going to pay full tuition. They're going to give me a start sheet. And they think I'm Puerto Rican. Should I tell them? My mother said, hell no. And so I kept my mouth shut and went out to the campus. Um, and later, two of the people that we formed, there were not enough people of each ethnic group or cultural group to form their own campus caucuses on campus. You know how you have Black student programs and Latino studies and whatever. So we formed a non-white caucus, and it was everyone on campus that wasn't white and got together. There were 16 people, and two of them the next year we expanded, went to visit the Panther office, and they saw in a Panther paper an article about these young lords in Chicago. And they decided to get into a car and drive. And the reason it was only guys that went out there was that the women who were in the group said, we're not getting in the car with you and going to Chicago because the car's going to break down. You know, I mean, we were very practical. So it was just men that went out and met with Cha-Cha. But when they came back, they said, okay, we're now the East Coast Young Lords. And we had been meeting with people from other campuses. Juan Gonzalez had come out to Old Westbury from Columbia. Felipe Luciano had come from the Sikh program at Queens College. And we also had contact with a street gang on the Lower East Side. So we pulled different elements together, and that was the genesis of the Young Lords on the East Coast. And the Lords itself took the Panthers 10-point program and platform and expanded it because there also had to be an awareness and an acknowledgement of liberation for Puerto Rico and its colonial status. So it sort of went beyond where the Panther program went because of the nature of the Puerto Rican diaspora. Because we were in East Harlem, which most people call Spanish Harlem or El Barrio, they make an assumption that everyone is then Puerto Rican. And in New York, a third of the organization was either African American or mixed African American and Puerto Rican, or African American and Dominican or Haitian or whatever. We had one Mexican who walked all the way from Mexico to come and join us in New York. And he was a young brother, Adrian. We had somebody who was raised in Chinatown, you know. So the assumption is because we emphasize liberation for Puerto Rico and because we were predominantly Puerto Rican, if you look at the neighborhood, all you gotta do is go to East Harlem and you have, my cousins lived in Carver Projects and they're Panamanian, you know. So you have, we were very conscious of that. And I think that because I had spent my growing up years crossing those borders in New York City between ethnic groups, dancing salsa one night and dancing disco the next night, my friends and everyone I knew were mixed groups of people. Were there issues? Yes, because one of the biggest issues we had to confront in the Lords, that internal baggage that you bring with you, is racism. And don't think that there isn't racism, colorism, and classism in the context of the Puerto Rican community. And a lot of what is Afro-Latinidad had been erased. And we had to work with people to deal with, in the Palante film that Iris Morales did, Richie Perez talks about, we had to deal with pelo bueno, pelo malo, good hair, bad hair, you know, and those kind of issues. Nowadays, young people are now beginning to address colorism, but that was a complete and totally new topic to be dealt with. Even the great revolutionary Puerto Rican hero, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, it's like naming God, you know. Nobody talks about the fact that his mother was a black maid, you know, who was the byproduct of a white upper class Puerto Rican impregnating her and pushing her to the side, you know. He's never described as Afro-Boricua, you know. We addressed that in the Young Lords. We were the first people who marched through the streets and dealt with having an afro. You know, before then, everybody get your hair processed, get your hair straightened. You know, nobody wanted to talk about having kinky hair. And this sounds like not a great revolutionary project. It was revolutionary. It still is. Because if you have people who are schizophrenic about who they are and have low self-esteem, I've had so many young people say, I shot dope because I was the darkest one in my family and how I was treated. That's some of that baggage that you bring with you. And I think that it was really important that in the Young Lords, we began to address that internal oppression as well as dealing with, you know, the big words of colonialism, imperialism, et cetera, police brutality. And we learned also that we had to learn to listen to our elders. You know, you don't just go barging in talking political rhetoric when you walk into somebody's house. You walk in the door and you say, bendición. And then you sit down and she asks you, you want some bustelo? You sit down and drink coffee. You know, you talk. And you're not like clobbering people over the head with your radical politics. That is the worst way to organize. We learn to listen to people in the community. And instead of yakking at them all the time. And they were very good lessons to learn. And if it's one thing I say to young people when I'm meeting with them, I say, my dad told me, if your grandmother can't understand you, you failed. I keep it that simple.
That's a really succinct and beautiful way of putting it, right? You know, especially as we work within our own communities, or, you know, as you kind of touched on, you've got people working in communities that aren't their communities, right? And we do struggle now with, you know, the type of coalition organizing that happens now, where people perhaps feel like they don't have a voice or don't have a voice unless they're in their own group. Is, you know, there's so many lessons from what your father just told us, right? I wanted to connect that a little bit to all the interviews that, or not the interviews, the archival footage, Ray, that you got from for the film. And, you know, when the Rainbow Coalition in a way is sort of a public organizing project amongst groups that were quite clandestine in many ways. So how did they use media? You know, how did they know what to document, what not to document? Were they filming this material for their own purposes? Was it, you know, an FBI archive? Is it where did the media come from, and sort of how was media used for organizing at the time?
Yeah, I think unfortunately Chicago did not have a lot of there aren't a lot of archives about the Young Lords in Chicago. Luckily, there were some members of the Young Lords that took some photos that we used, and they were also, there was a photographer that worked for one of the newspapers, a guy named Paul Sequeta, that actually took a lot of photos of the Black Panthers, the Young Patriots, and the Young Lords, so which was unusual. And so I was able to go and meet with him, and then he actually, you know, opened up a wealth of photographic archives. He since has passed, but yeah, it was difficult because, you know, Chicago was not an independent film. And, you know, again, this goes back to, you know, sort of giving support to our independent filmmakers, because most of the good footage about Fred Hampton and the Rainbow Coalition came from an independent filmmaker called the Film Group. Okay, Mike Gray and Howard Alk. Now, Howard Alk is one of the founders of Second City, and that's where, you know, John Belushi and all those guys came out of. So, I mean, these are creative people that are without that footage, I don't know what would have happened with Fred Hampton's story, because that footage is what kept him in the public's eye, and I was able to mine that. Now, the template of all of this, the best group that's ever done it has been the Young Lords in New York. So we'll let Denise, because they had great photographers. They had, you know, the I forgot what it's called. They had, you know, independent filmmakers there. They have beautiful footage, beautiful photographs. And so they're like the, you know, the gold standard of movements that have done that. And that's maybe it's one of the reasons why it took so long, because you had to find little piece together, all these little pieces in order to tell the story, because there wasn't a lot out there necessarily. And just very quickly, because I want to hear Denise talk about that, is I just want to recognize Hy Thurman is here. He's on the thing. He's one of the founders of the Young Patriots, and he was part of that coalition in Chicago. He's on the Zoom.
Awesome. It would be great to bring him in for the Q&A.
Sure, if you'd like to. But yeah, Denise, I mean, do you agree? I mean, you guys had, you know.
Yeah. Well, we had, we just happened to have the good fortune to have people who had previous background in working with media. We had connections to people who had gotten on radio stations, you know. So we immediately made contact with WBAI, the Pacifica station in New York. And so we had Palante Radio, you know. So we had a radio show. We had in the organization a brilliant photographer, Iran Maristani, who was a lord, you know, and he was taking photographs. But we also had a white photographer, Michael Abramson, who sort of made a decision to embed himself with the lords. He just kind of moved in. And wherever he went, there he was. He was taking pictures. And he also interviewed people at the same time. So you had a sort of a narrative happening, and then you had the photographs, and that was the basis of the book, his book, Palante. In New York, you had newsreel became third world newsreel. And so we had relationships with people like Chris Choi. And because we were also relating also to Iwakum, Most Righteous Harmonious Fist. But you had the Rat, you had underground newspapers. We used to lay out our paper at the Rat, and which later had a women's takeover and whatever. That's a whole nother history. So you also had some of the first Puerto Ricans and Black Americans who had jobs on local television, and they were our friends. You know, we got to know people like Gloria Rojas or whomever. And so when we did an action, when we took over something, or we hijacked a TB truck or whatever, we were guaranteed to get coverage in the Daily News, the whomever, you know, local television was out there. So there's that archival footage too. So they make you pay a fortune to get some of that stuff. We had a very clear sense of the importance of media, and it's no coincidence that after, you know, the Young Lords went bye-bye, you look at Juan Gonzalez is the co-host of Democracy Now! Felipe Luciano has a show on the radio. Mickey Melendez has a show on the radio. I went to DC and was one of the key people in putting together the first minority controlled Pacific station. And when I came back, I became executive director of the Black Filmmaker Foundation, got involved with Media Network because I understood it was so important to have film, video, um, writing for publications, art, and I'm talking about art as in posters and things that have a political impact. Um, but what was really key was that you get young people to learn to document these histories as they're happening, because what's happening today is somebody else's history 10 years from now, you know. And I mean, I have the advantage of being old. You know, I'll be 74 next month. And so I can look back on things, and there are a lot of things that I remember now that I know were never documented. And it's going to take young people need to go around and do exactly what Ray has done. Talk to people, get their stories down. And they don't have to be, I always told my students, have you interviewed your parents? Have you interviewed your grandmother? Have you interviewed Auntie B or whatever? You'll be surprised if you sit down and act like you don't know them, you know, and get their stories. And I've had students come back to me and say, I had no idea my grandmother worked in a parachute factory in World War II. You know, I had no idea, you know. So it's not just, oh, I want to interview, you know, important comrade so and so, but we have to paint complete portraits of our communities, and that becomes a tool. Exposing those histories becomes a tool because it's still not going to get taught in your school. We have a responsibility to educate our own folks about a history that they do not want us to know. They murdered Fred Hampton because he was too damn powerful. They murdered him because he was making a coalition happen. He was probably the most dangerous person in the United States because he was crossing all of those barriers. So if you erase him from the history, you're also erasing the work he did. And he said, I am a revolution. No disrespect meant, but Jesse Jackson said, I am somebody. There is a difference, a big difference. And that's why Fred is dead and Jesse ain't. And I will shut up on that.
Yes, I love that. Okay, so I want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat, and we'll get to those in just a bit. And I wanted to, at the beginning we started by saying how great it is to have Ray with us because he kind of embodies like what we're talking about with Feed the Real and Insurgent Imagination around like filmmakers telling organizers' story. And I think, Denise, you just did a really amazing job talking about how organizers can also move the other way, right? Like you went and got into broadcasting and production and different things like that to make sure that your stories and not just yours, but like other stories were told and heard and captured. So I just really, really appreciate that and kind of that overlap that the two of you have. I don't know if either of you want to make any comments on that or any other comments on our conversation thus far before we get into audience questions.
I'd rather answer questions, right?
Yeah, same here. Yes.
Great. Let's do it. Okay. So a question we have from the audience. How do each of you decompress after having hard conversations, be it with your work or organizing? What is your method?
You want the truth?
Always, yes.
Well, spirituality has helped me a lot, and I know that we're all supposed to be godless, Marxists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But over the years, I found that I needed to deal with toxicity in a way that was rooted in diasporic, um, Black and Native spirituality. That's one thing. And I garden, which helps me work certain things out. And I play World of Warcraft.
Awesome.
I kill things.
That's incredible. I do the first two. I'm gonna have to try the third. I don't know. Ray?
It just depends. I mean, one of the things I do, especially as I get older, is when I mentioned I'm not a good organizer, it's because I don't like to be around a lot of people a lot. So if I'm feeling stressed, I tend to just kind of go more insular to try to have a quiet around me. And just going to like a coffee shop and having a coffee and sitting there for like an hour, it just does wonders for me. I don't know, something about it, just getting away. That clears my mind enough. Luckily, I don't need a lot of downtime. I usually am pretty focused about my goals. And so, and again, but the key for me is just, having a lot of quiet time, a lot of time to myself. And that's what kind of keeps me kind of solid.
I would add to this. So something that in my organizing, I ask a lot of folks about is like, what's going to keep us in the long game, like what's going to keep us in it, into organizing, into our art, into our passions. Do you have advice that might be different from the things that you mentioned for like what's kept you doing this work over the years?
One thing I noticed, this is just an observation, is that I think all the activists I've met that have been in it a long time have a great sense of humor. They know that the stakes are high, but they can, they're not, it's not an obsession, a thing with them. They can talk about a serious thing, and then they can go and go outside and feed the birds. That's what Bobby used to do: feed the birds and talk to the birds, and just. I think that's a key, is you got to be able to sort of not obsess about things. And again, that's just an observation. I think Chach is the same. I mean, he's a he loves telling stories. He loves laughing. A lot of that didn't come out in the film, and it's to my detriment. Is like, he would be telling funny stories, and as soon as you turn the camera on, then he's like, yes, and we did this, and we did that. So that's not his personality, but all the years I knew him, it was always the same. I was like, Chacha, can you just be yourself? Just be Chacha. And then, but anyone who ever spent any time with him know that he's probably one of the funniest guys, you'd ever meet. And I mean, and he's intelligent. That's what I think, good humor comes from being intelligent. And he'd always have a keen observation about something that would make it funny.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is not a microwave struggle, instant gratification, and the revolution is going to be televised in 2 minutes, and ding, the timer goes off. It is, for me, a struggle that doesn't have an end. And I'm fortunate enough to have been raised by a family that had me strongly connected to my ancestors. My parents raised me with stories of what happened to my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. I have pictures of my family coming out of slavery. I know the names of people who were enslaved. I know their stories. I know that my great-great-grandmother murdered her first 2 set of slave owners. She poisoned them. She was an herbalist. Good lady. And until she got a master that wasn't going to rape her and do whatever, she let him live, and then she got freed by emancipation. So I live in this connected world. And so it is not important for me to break things up into, it's a flow. And in that flow, like Ray was saying, there is laughter, there is humor, there is the smell of roses, I mean, I could just dig in the dirt and feel wonderful after doing that and making compost. And I love dancing. We would go out and go dancing. When COVID hit, I decided to shift my Sunday blog piece away from politics and history, and I've been doing music, just music. And people come in and talk about the music that they love because that's healing. And we have to heal, laugh, love, and fight all in a stream. And unfortunately, I have run into some really humorless, oppressively dogmatic people who are, they introduce themselves to me. Hi, I'm a revolutionary. And I'm like, oh shit, oh, excuse me. But it's kind of like, do they even see themselves? They're like a caricature of radicalness, and I call it ultra wokeism, and it's annoying as hell. And the intensity of their, they're not normal anymore. They're not like you. We're making struggle to change, so that we can all chill, at some point, and I am not going to ever, I hope I never get up and look in the mirror and see myself as this caricature of the revolutionary. I think that what you brought out in the film is one of the reasons that people love Fred Hampton so much, because he was real. He was like a regular dude. He was powerful, but he was also real. He could look you in the eye. He could laugh. He loved people. He was moved by love. And so be careful that you don't fall into the trap of whatever that is, and find ways to find things that uplift you and make you laugh, and hug somebody. We did a lot of hugging too. We marched and we fought. Some of us died, but we also hugged and kissed each other and played with the kids. One of the most wonderful things for me was when I was assigned to work at the free breakfast program and go pick those little crumb crutchers up and march them off to feed them pancakes and sausage and talk to them about politics and sing songs. And so children are our precious gems. And our youngest Lord, by the way, full young Lord, Augie, was 12 years old in New York, Valerie's son. And he was amazing. His face would light up and he'd say, I'm going to sell some newspapers today. We're going to organize a community, and don't push your kids away, and think they can't understand stuff, because they understand very basically what hurt is, what pain is, and what joy is. And we need to raise them to embrace more of the joy.
So much wisdom. Thank you so much, Denise. We have one more question from the audience. Again, if there's anything you would like to chat or ask, you can put it in the chat. This question is for Ray. How do you make edit decisions to cut from what I imagine was a ton of amazing footage?
For the specific cuts, we had an editor, Dan Marino, who was amazing. Each year when you look at POV Independent Lens, she has a film that she edited. She's like at the highest levels. She has films at Sundance almost every year. So she's amazing. But part of what we talked about was the story, and so the story arcs. And so that's how, if we look at it, each character has an arc. And when you think about it, it was the arc was them meeting Fred Hampton and how that transformed them. Again, in my bio, I talk, one of the things I'm fascinated by is transformation, how people change. And so that was one of the reasons why I connect with Chacha, is because I think his transformation from coming out of a gang structure to taking that and creating a political movement, which, you know, had chapters all over the United States. I think that is to me an incredible story in itself. And so each person, like Hy Thurman, we talk about his transformation from coming from, I'm confusing his states, but it might be Tennessee. You know, if I'm wrong, Hy, I apologize. And going to Chicago, and then, you know, being a young person and learning, and then joining these militant groups, and then having this Confederate flag. And at a certain point, you know, by themselves, they realized that that flag was counter-revolutionary and it was racist. They came onto that realization by themselves. And I think that's the genius of Fred Hampton, is he allowed that transformation to happen. If Fred Hampton told them to get rid of the flag, then they get rid of the flag, but they haven't changed. They still have an affinity with the flag, but they did that on their own. And then it became a real thing for them, you know, and of course, Bob Lee, you know, him dealing with that journey that he had been on, you know, coming out of a segregated South, going to a segregated North. I think that, and then we see him at the end, you know, basically, you know, we were just talking about how to keep yourself going. Bob Lee was, you know, still a Black Panther when he passed. He was still, I mean, we didn't show it in the film, but he's in the hospital and he's organizing a clothing drive in the hospital. One of the nurses was missing an earring. He was like, "Oh, we got to get you another earring. You can't have one earring." And so he had that kind of, you know, sensibility. And again, it's like a love of people. He didn't, you know, no matter who you were, Bob Lee wanted to help you. And, you know, he took joy with being around you. And anyway, hopefully the film worked as a, you know, a document about this movement. But I also want to be people to connect with the individuals as human beings, you know, going through their life and making choices, and where those choices led them to. And I think that's what the film does. And again, you know, making the film, I knew that, again, I really was conscious that we were creating a historical record, because there was no film about this movement out before, and the people are getting at an age where I knew that later on down the road, we may not have all these people there to tell the story. So I thought it was very important to tell it. And I'm so glad that I was able to find the funding to ultimately get it done in time, because again, now Bob Lee has passed, and now Bobby McGinnis from the Young Patriots has passed, who's in the film. And even photographers like Paul Siqueta, who I use a lot of his photos, has passed. So again, we're at this, you know, everyone's at a precipice, and history is like kind of sliding through our fingers. And so to me, again, having worked in all these other films, it was so important to tell this story, because again, this to me is like my final statement about that era, was that everything was moving towards this and everyone believed this. And out of that, I think there's something for us that we should take to heart, and we should, you know, think about it as we move forward, especially now in this country, the choices that we need to make in terms of how do we move forward as communities? Do we try to do it alone, or do we try to, you know, work with other people that, you know, are in similar situations to ours, and see what can come of that?
I have a sort of a follow-up, since we have, you know, you who's interviewed so many people, we have Denise, we have Hy Thurman with us. Hollywood tried to make or made a version, right, of this, of where the story, your story, perhaps one of the most important stories, is like a blip of 15 to 30 seconds, you know, of a movie. And, you know, one of the things that was saddest to me about that film coming out, and I will get in trouble for saying this because I know the filmmakers, but it's that now they're not going to fund, no one's going to fund another movie about Fred Hampton. Like, that was the saddest thing to me, right? It's like the movie that really touches on the organizing, at least in a fictional format, is not gonna get made, right? And that's why the documentary is so important for people to see. But they didn't capture anything that you all, you know, the real story that you guys told. And I'm assuming they probably didn't even talk to a lot of folks who were in the movement. But as filmmakers try to, let's say, fictionalize history, that's the area that I work in, what are ways that we need to engage the stakeholders while while those folks are still with us, and even afterwards, like engage with the legacy in a way that really honors the people who were there, rather than just uses their story or like uses their image.
And I want to, so we now have Hyde joining us. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor. And if you want to jump in and contribute, please feel free.
Thank you. Well, I can talk about the film that you're talking about, which I really didn't appreciate the film very much. I think it did expose, Fred Hampton, to the rest of the world that he needed to be exposed to. A lot of people knew about it, but it certainly didn't give him any justice, and it certainly didn't give the young patriots any justice because, the scene was totally wrong. First of all, Fred Hampton never came to Uptown because we didn't want him to be in Uptown because we were afraid, that he would really be a target. He would have come there if we asked him, but Bobby Lee was our main contact, and but to me, the film was just Hollywood hype. If it hadn't have been for some of, Chairman Fred's speeches in there and interaction, it would have been just a piece of crap. That's my opinion. I don't recommend that film to anyone, other than the fact that they could learn something about Chairman Fred. And I just think that you're right. Maybe another film may not be made, but I sure hope it would be. They never talked to us at the Young Patriots. Plus the fact that they showed a scene in there that wasn't real. Huge Confederate flag on the wall, and it did not represent us at all at that time in terms of the location, the meeting. It put a portion in there where one of the Young Patriots had somewhat of a verbal altercation with Hampton or some of the Panthers. That never happened. So they really didn't know. They really didn't know what to put in there, but I did try to make contact with them while they were filming it. I never had any success, and I was really insulted by the casting company. And I told them who I was, and they said, well, we didn't think you existed because we couldn't find you on Facebook. And that was the research. And I said, well, I'm here. And the woman that I talked to said, don't tell me how to do my effing job, And then this is true. This was people doing this film. And then I got a letter from the filming company that stated that, they're sure I would appreciate the film once it came out, but I couldn't return any emails to the lawyer. But, in answer to that film, I do all I can to explain it to people and let them know that it's good that, Chairman Fred was in there, and there's a couple other scenes, but as far as it being a very truthful film, it is not. And certainly the Young Patriots and others, realize that. But I will say I've really enjoyed this discussion here. It's really beautiful. It's really a great discussion.
I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks.
And that is important. And thank you for saying that, because as far as I'm concerned, the film is a piece of shit. And, that's very nice. People have now learned the name of Fred Hampton from that movie, but they have gotten it completely wrong-headed. And the fact that I was bitching about this earlier on, the fact that they made the main character a snitch cop, okay, and centered that person And particularly because I resent it because I've lost so many friends because of COINTELPRO. You know, they
Yes.
murdered. And so to make the COINTELPRO creep, you know, the center of the movie, no, hell no. Mm-mm.
But there's from a sort of a Hollywood point of view, the scary thing is, Denise, that somebody is going to make the Young Lords movie now, right? Like Revolution is marketable, and we got to be vigilant for when that version of that story comes out. And I'm sure that the Young Patriots movie is not far behind, and I don't mean that in a cynical way, just that telling these stories in a way, in a sort of fictional way, as an insider, becomes so cynical, right? It becomes, how can we use the movement to get success, right? And I hope that when the next one comes along, that we and our movement elders and folks who are there can, and maybe this is something for me to do, is like, can get to them before they destroy or kind of corrupt the message.
I think that filmmakers need to do exactly what you're doing here today, and telling the truth about the mythology that's being constructed. Because I'm on Twitter fighting with people 24/7, and young people go, well, let me tell you about Malcolm X. And I go, so what do you know about Malcolm X? Well, they saw the movie, okay?
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, did you ever bother to, his speeches are on records. You could go and listen to the actual Malcolm X and not talk about deconstructing the film, That's their favorite word. They deconstruct everything, and so the same is true. Yes, you're right. They will come along and try to do the Patriots or try to do the Young Lords or whatever, a la Hollywood. But it's real important that can be a whole nother thing that filmmakers to do. Because Ray has done it. He has put what that first Rainbow Coalition was, the reality with the real people. And y'all got cameras and y'all got, the ability to do this stuff far better than we had way back in the day when it was like big tape decks. You can do stuff on your little cell phones that is better than we did with all that equipment and having to send things to be processed, so you have the tools, you just have to get out there and do it and start recording truths, and not Hollywood bullshit. Excuse my French again. Merde.
Okay,
so go ahead, Katie.
Okay, we are wrapping up for this event, and I just, again, feel so honored to have each of you with us. As we close out, Hi and Denise, do you have any insights or recommendations? Usually as organizers, we close these things with a call to action, and anytime an organizer has a mic, it's important to have a call to action. So what's your call to action for any organizers or storytellers or aspiring storytellers or aspiring organizers to carry on the work that you all did? And maybe before you do that, I'll pose my question to Ray, my final question to Ray. We want to know what's coming next from you.
And we know that sometimes we can't talk about these things before they're produced.
Yes. Okay. So call to action from the organizers, and what's next for Ray?
Hi.
Okay. Well, the question was, what are we doing now, or what we're doing next?
Well, I would love to hear what you're up to now, yeah. But then do you have something you would like to tell folks, like a call to action for how people can carry forward the work that you're doing or that you used to do?
Okay. Yeah. You got everyone that I talk to, I convince them they need to study history. They need to study what was happening in the past, and they need to get actively involved, in some organization, or, just do something. I think one of the best examples that was given to me is in the film that Ray made, and Bobby Lee explaining to me, if you don't know where to organize, you go to your front door, you go to your back door, you go to your left, you go to your right street, and then you pick a direction. Because there's always somebody there who's going to need something that you can talk to and try to organize. And not to ever give up. Because a movement is not a movement if it stops moving. So it's got to keep moving, and certainly the Rainbow Coalition has moved all these years into a point now to where there's a lot of talk and very serious action about a second Rainbow Coalition. Recently, I was asked to organize a committee, and I'm organizing a committee of elders with several organizations, and some of the we have elders from the Young Lords involved, and the Panthers, and the Young Patriots. But there's organizations that's actually getting together now and forming a second Rainbow Coalition, and that's one of them is called the New Era Young Lords. There's the New African Black Panthers, American Indian Movement, and the White Panthers, and they're actively meeting to organize, a Rainbow Coalition. And I'm working with them. I've been asked to put a group together to to give them advice and point them in the right direction. And one of the things that I tell them is that whatever you do, make sure it's in the legacy of the original Rainbow Coalition. And that's what they're doing, is they're following the legacy of the Rainbow Coalition. I also have organized a North Alabama School for Organizers, which follows the Rainbow Coalition, and it's called Educate to Organize. We have various classes, courses for organizers or other people that want to be organizers, as well as fireside chats with a number of people, in hopes of giving the information to organizers that they would need when they go out and try to organize. So, we have a lot of classes in organizing history and the history of Native Americans, Latin America. We get all kinds of different classes in imperialism and environmental history, and one of the areas we also work on are the various titles or definitions of organizing and what is an organizer, and try to determine if they're in the right organizing role or if they could take on a different role. So it's all been, the Rainbow Coalition has all been moving into that area. So that's pretty much what I'm involved in. Also working a lot with the homeless. So, and Ray and I seem to get in trouble a lot too. So he and I work together. But anyway, that's that's where we're at right now, as far as what the Young Patriots have been up to.
Great. I love that update. Thank you so much. And all your work sounds really beautiful. Denise?
One of the things that has been disturbing me an awful lot is that essentially a lot of younger people that I encounter who call themselves progressive have been advocating for statehood for Puerto Rico. And I get taken aback. I said, you call yourself progressive and woke, and you're talking about not understanding the nature of colonialism. And I find it so much of what we were about was raising people's consciousness about PR, and a lot of that's been erased. It's amazing to me how much people don't know about Puerto Rico. So one of the things that I've been really committed to, because I point out to people, somebody says to me, why do you care about Puerto Ricans? Because you're Black. And I go, why shouldn't I? And it pisses me off, you know. Only Puerto Ricans are supposed to learn the history of Puerto Rico. Only Puerto Ricans are supposed to understand what this country has done to its colonies, not just Puerto Rico either, because you've got Guam and Samoa and St. Thomas and Croix, whatever. So I've been encouraging people to, again, cross over some of those bridges, break down some of those barriers, and I specifically target a lot of folks in the Black community, because I say there is statehood for DC and Puerto Rico is not the same thing. And I lived in DC a long time, and I was one of the early people that was in the whole statehood movement. That was when DC didn't even have the right to have a mayor, you know. So it's more for me, because I can't get out in the street and organize anymore. I have certain disabilities, so I have to spend my time talking through via Zoom. But I'm encouraging people to, they have purposely kept you from understanding what that history is and who Puerto Ricans are, and why the only thing that makes sense is independence for the island. And we've got a long way to go, because any inroads that we made back in the 60s and the 70s, we've gone backwards. And people just say to me, no, but they should be a state, and then there would never have been a problem with Hurricane Maria. Nobody would have died. And I go, yeah, that like Katrina, you know, and or like Flint's water, you know, the protection for people of color and poor folks of statehood are no blessing. And we can see it. So again, raising those issues, and I ask people just to sit down and think, did they ever teach you anything about Puerto Rico in school other than Christopher Columbus came and discovered America? And I'm finding too often that the answer is no. So we have all the work that we did with that kind of education has essentially been erased. So that's my primary purpose at this point in time.
It's really important. Thank you. And Ray, we'll close out with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Katie, and thanks Current Movements for having this discussion. You know, when the film was made, I knew it was an important film for me, and I thought the topic was important, but I also knew that even if you saw it on public television, you didn't have that chance to talk about it. Again, the importance of it is that it reflects about today, what's happening today. And it's a living history that we're part of. And so this discussions like that's one of the reasons I wanted to do discussions like this, so we can keep the dialogue going, use the film as a springboard to talk about what's happening in our communities today. And that's what I think you guys have done. And I'm really, thankful for that. Want to thank Firelight Media, who funded in part, this talk. This is one of the series of talks we've been doing as part of an impact campaign. We're actually having one in San Francisco. It hasn't been announced yet, but is going to be there. Erica Huggins. We're going to do a screening at the Roxy Theater on August 29th. Again, I guess I shouldn't be saying it because we haven't signed a contract, but with the Roxy. But that'll probably be our last discussion as part of this specific grant. But I want to keep doing this because, again, it's one way to hold me accountable as a filmmaker, is to, again, not make the film say, hey, here's the film, you guys, good luck. I want to keep in dialogue with the people in the film. And then also, again, I think this is one of the things I learned when I was out on the Rosebud Reservation is that, the folks who live out there who are Lakota, when they have events, everyone's there. You have the older folks, you have little kids running around. I think for our communities, we need to, when we have discussions, I wanted to have the older activists with the younger activists in dialogue. I think that was an important part of it. Because again, it's like, I think it's going to take all of us, all of our minds put together in order to be able to confront these issues that we're facing, because, they're ongoing and they're intense. And so anyway, I always enjoy having these folks together, because I think there's something to be learned from both the younger folks and then the elder statesmen or the elder activists in our community. So thank you, Denise, and thank you, Hai, for showing up. I wasn't scheduled to be here, but I appreciate you showing up. In terms of what I'm doing now, I have another film. It's hard to talk about because I'm still trying to define what it is, but it's not a big grand film like this. It's a story about a family dealing with the death of one of their family members. And I'm following this over a 5 or 6 year period of time, how the family's dealing with this. So it's a very different kind of film, but I think it's, I'm learning a lot. And then as a filmmaker, that's important to me, to be able to challenge myself as a maker. And I think it's going to be a film that will hopefully open up, again, more dialogues. To me, there's not enough of that in this country. There's just information we're being bombarded with, but I think we need to, have, bring our community together and sort of figure out, things together. And so, again, thank you for hosting this event. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully you folks have too.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really wonderful. I'll let Katie close things out. But what we always say on, when we're doing our show, is we encourage people to keep loving and keep fighting.
Right on.
Yes, and so I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this. And it will be live on Facebook, so you can share, or recorded on Facebook, so you can share it out with your friends and family, or you can go back to it. Follow us on Instagram and on Facebook, Current Movements, and subscribe to our podcast, Insurgent Imagination, to hear more amazing interviews with filmmakers, activists, artists, and healers. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Feed the Real, where we're bringing together aspiring storytellers and filmmakers who wouldn't otherwise be able to have access to amazing folks like this. So we will see you again for events in July. And until then, have a great summer.
Thank you.